Okay, welcome everyone to this webinar hosted by the Nikon Club and Blue Number. We're very excited to have you here today on the topic of using data to amplify workers' voice. So we have two great speakers here, one from the Nikon Club and one from Blue Number. This webinar will be diving into the relationship between modern slavery, data, and the private sector. There'll be plenty of time to ask questions to the speakers. So please feel free to write down any questions directly within the chat box. We're also very keen to hear your views on this session. So we do encourage you to listen closely to the speakers, and how can you consider utilizing data to your advantage within your business or industry. It's also an excellent opportunity to let us know a little bit more of what you're looking for. Perhaps there's tools, resources, trainings, or webinar topics. So please feel free to add them directly within the chat box. You will have a chance to hear the different views here from Phoebe from the Micro Club, and also hear from Pooven. Right at the end, we'll have a question and answer. So please feel free to add the questions there. So with that, I'm going to pass over to Phoebe, the program director here at the Mekong Club. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Nolan. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining today. It's great to be here. So my job today is to set the scene a little bit for us on the relationship between data, technology, worker voice, and the broader topic of modern day slavery. Before I pass over to Pooven, who's going to dive deeper into his particular work and innovation that he's conducting through Blue Number. So first, let's consider global supply chains. So there are a number of key characteristics of global supply chains that can lead to forced labor going on undetected. These characteristics tend to be pretty common across different industries, across different products, and I'm sure many of these characteristics will be very familiar with a lot of you guys on the call here today. So global supply chains by their very nature are complex beings. They involve a multitude of actors. They involve brands, their suppliers, their sub-suppliers, recruitment agencies, labor brokers, the workers themselves within the supply chains, social auditors, NGOs like ourselves, and even governments, all involved in this wide ecosystem of actors that are producing the goods and the products that we consume. This complexity is often then coupled by a lack of true transparency. So even with significant time and resources that are invested into better understanding supply chains, there are very few large brands who are kind of able to confidently map out all of these players within this ecosystem. And even if they are, this is such a large, complex network of people and organizations that it's unlikely that they would be having regular interaction with them or conducting regular checks on what's happening within that network. So this inherently can lead to hidden exploitation. We see workers being forced to pay excessive recruitment fees to secure jobs, for example. That this issue goes undetected often, despite our best efforts to find it, because employment agents are used, or there's multiple levels between the supplier and the auditor and the brand involved. We see issues with employment contracts being changed or not honoured. We see workers in factories being subject to illegal or exploitative employment conditions, but being so far from the brand at the end or the end consumer that this kind of information is going unnoticed, or it's unreachable in the current state of data sharing. And of course, bad actors do exist in the world, and they certainly exist within global supply chains. So these are people that are seeking to exploit this complexity and exploit this lack of transparency for their own gain, exploiting people through force, fraud, coercion, which in the very worst of situations can lead to what we call modern day slavery. So Pooven today is going to be speaking about his solution that uses blockchain technology. And I wanted to first kind of set the scene and give a little bit of an overview of this technology before we begin. This is a somewhat simplified definition, so forgive me, but hopefully it will help us kind of frame our discussion later and give a little bit more context for those of you on the call who are maybe more new to this technology. So blockchain is an increasingly important player in the world of addressing modern slavery and supply chain transparency. And it's certainly an area that is looking to really disrupt some of those challenges and issues that I've just outlined. So put very, very simply, blockchain is a digital system that's used for recording transactions and related data in a way that can be shared with multiple people or entities at the same time in a form that's secure and cannot be altered or deleted. So it's decentralized. So no one party controls that ledger of data or ledger of information. Everybody can see any changes or updates that are made that are within the network, and they can trust that everybody within their particular network is looking at the exact same information as everybody else if we're using blockchain. Now, when we were first setting out to explore blockchain technology, we did a lot of reading and a lot of consulting to try to understand this in simple terms. And somebody shared this handy visual that I've got on the screen here now. So on the screen here, if you look to the left, we can see how information is traditionally exchanged within kind of typical supply chain. So we have companies, we have buyers, suppliers, all a manner of other stakeholders, all exchanging different information with each other through different channels of communication. They're having different conversations, and there's no kind of one shared information source here. Now imagine if the information being shared here was about the working conditions of the workers within a supply chain. You can see how easily an important or even crucial piece of information might be lost within this wider web of communication, or even how it could be deliberately hidden if one of these parties in the network had an ulterior motive to keep that information from the others. Now on the right, we see a visualization of how information can be exchanged using blockchain technology. So everybody is looking at the same set of information that's been secured in these visual blocks. If, for example, a forced labor incident occurred and information about it could be exchanged in this way, then it would be identified and shared immediately. So this is a bit of an oversimplification. I'm sure Pooven will go into a lot more detail during his session, but hopefully this gives a little bit more context around how this technology can work. So just to recap on the characteristics of blockchain technology, it's decentralized. So no one party controls the information. The information that's entered cannot be easily deleted or changed. And ultimately, many applications that are using this technology are really looking to bring greater trust, transparency, and security to the process of information exchange or transactions. So just wanted to outline a few practical applications of what we're seeing in terms of this technology being applied within the supply chain world. So blockchain has been used to map origins of a product, even kind of down to raw material level. So one of the kind of first movers or well-known examples of this is an organization called Everledger, which started out by tracking diamonds down to the mine level. So you could enter the code of the diamond and you can see where it's come from, how and when it has been sold, how it's changed hands, and ultimately kind of the journey that that diamond has taken to then land in front of you. This kind of data sharing is being promoted more widely to better empower consumers to make decisions. So being able to walk into a supermarket, scan a QR code on a product and see the supply chain for that product laid out in front of you, something that currently as a consumer, it's very, very hard to understand where the products and services that you're purchasing are really coming from. Now, of course, there are challenges and downsides to this kind of technology, and I'm sure we'll get into that during the Q&A discussion session, but it kind of demonstrates a bit of a shift towards exploring how we can use data and use greater transparency to empower more ethical sourcing and consumer decisions, ultimately encouraging brands to be much more transparent. Document fraud and document kind of abuses perpetuated through control over documentation is another key issue within the modern slavery world, and another key area this technology is exploring. So modern slavery can happen through the use of such means as confiscating workers' identity documents or their passports, taking their identity from them, falsifying their employment contracts or other key kind of supply chain related documentation to try to hide exploitation, keep that veil over the true conditions of the workers. If we're looking to move towards more kind of trustworthy data sharing, blockchain enabled or otherwise, exploring these kinds of technologies, we're really looking to make these kinds of practices much harder to pull off, ultimately trying to cut off the ease at which people are exploiting others through this kind of documentation control process. Some kinds of technology are being used to track and distribute payments to workers, bringing more transparency to that process. And ultimately, and I know Pooven is going to be elaborating a lot on this point, data sharing in a transparent and trustworthy way can bring brands, consumers, and the actual workers within those supply chains a lot closer, if not physically, through the sharing and more transparency within the data process. The more we create the channels to facilitate this, the better equipped we will be as a society to find and address modern slavery in a quickly and in a more meaningful way than ever before, we hope. So with that, hopefully I have laid out a good basis for this conversation. Looking forward to hearing your questions and having a discussion afterwards. But with that, I will pass over to you, Pooven, and stop sharing my screen. Thank you.
Thanks, Phoebe, and thanks to Mekong Club for inviting me to share some thoughts on this. I'm going to just share my screen now. For a second. So much of what you have said, Phoebe, actually. So I'm sharing my screen. Is why Blue Number exists. I have a history in multinational companies and then at the UN, looking at this challenge. I mean, the various challenges that you had outlined in your presentation, particularly in the arenas of human rights and then in the global agri-food system. And one of the problems that I had identified is that it is very difficult to measure or to remedy some of the wicked problems that exist in these global situations without having a proper unit of analysis. And the unit of analysis that is clearly absent or has been clearly absent for a while is the impact on humans and the actual people in that system that you're trying to measure. So just to pick up on some of the points that you had introduced in your presentation about technology. I think when we speak about technology, we always defer to the idea that it's something high tech, it's something new. I mean, you had mentioned blockchain and so forth, but I would say there are 4 levels of how technology can be adopted. Is the technology available, for example, to address all of the points that you had raised with regard to transparency, knowing who's in the chain, et cetera, et cetera? Is it possible to access that technology? So how accessible is it to all of the people from the supply chain operators all the way down to the to the workers and all the intermediaries. Is there a willingness to adopt this technology by all of the people concerned? And then, of course, is there an ability to adopt? So do people really know what they're dealing with when that technology comes into play and into their lives? Now, I would argue that actually, if we wanted to achieve everything that you had pointed out in your presentation, that technology already exists and has existed for hundreds of years. If we look at the colonial system of how they managed ledgers, you knew exactly how many slaves produced how much commodity, which ships the slaves were on first, and then the commodities were on coming back from the plantations in the colonies. You knew who insured all the ships, because if any of those ships went down, whether they were carrying slaves or whether they were carrying commodities, somebody had to underwrite the costs of that. Who was liable? Who profited? All of this was actually known, and it was already on a centralized ledger system. So if you look at the records of the East India Company, you look at the records of any of the transatlantic organizations that built an empire on that kind of information. The tech existed. And all of those criteria, was it available? Was it accessible? Were people willing to adopt it? Obviously not those at the end of the chain, literally, because they were not considered people, but property. And the ability to adopt, the banks, the governments, the defense systems, the taxation authorities, all of those people had that in place for them. So now the question becomes the value of that information to the stakeholder group. And what does that mean? And I would say that today, and especially my own experience in human rights and in agri-food, has led to this, what you're seeing on the screen now, which is I think that having a digital ID transforms that idea of equal opportunity, equity. What I think is that today, when you have identity, and it is used it is defined by data, it enables everyone to participate in that chain in a different way. And so the work that we do at Blue Number is actually to help people to understand how that works. But fundamentally, a Blue Number is a digital ID. It can be ascribed to various points. So there's people, organizations, places, and things, and it allows for the person to become a primary key across different data sets. And that changes the relationship of the person to the data set. In fact, once you make people central to that, it does become, the person becomes central, it becomes core. I mean, literally, it becomes a worker-centric system or a person-centric system, like a consumer-centric system. So we have certain principles that guide us. So this is a table that shows our principles and our rights. We have autonomy, identity, inclusion, ownership, transparency, compensation, interdependence, and accessibility. And now if you take the technologies that exist today, which you were discussing, for example, blockchain and all of the rest of it, you now have that technology available at a time when we are concerned with ESG. ESG is the mature state of CSR, of sustainability, because it finally includes the bigger picture. It's not just one actor acting, but actually the way that the system that we need to all operate in functions. You have environmental, social, governance, but then there's a multitude of elements within that, of which you have sustainability and CSR and so forth. But there's nothing about ESG that necessarily talks about doing good. It's about getting the system working right. And one of the key parts of that, I believe, is to make sure that you have this core set of principles and rights that evolve what we had before as being the function of a corporation, the function of the duty of the state, and so forth. And at the center of this, you have got SSI. So this is self-sovereign identity. Blue Number is a sovereign steward. Sovereign is a global network that actually governs self-sovereign identity. It's a nonprofit. We are also a nonprofit when we look at SSI. And there are various aspects of self-sovereign identity, which is agency, control, protection, that come into play. And this is an idea that someone can basically create their own identity and then maintain it. So before I go completely into the weeds on this, I'm just going to take a few points of that: agency, control, and protection. Reading the points here about delegation, decentralization, transparency, you will have heard these terms when it comes to aspects, for example, like privacy of data. When it comes to how is it that you manage your Facebook account, what is a single sign-on, who has access to that data, who is responsible for ensuring that data is protected or is private, who can give consent before that data is used by anyone else. So this is this whole story here. And what we believe at Blue Number is that that must be centered around the individual. But to the extent that no one really can be tasked with looking after that individual's property, that individual's data property, they must actually know what it means to have that property and to be able to use that property and leverage it, i.e. their data, because in the digital age, that is the prime currency. So you cannot necessarily trust, if you are a farmer or if you're a consumer, I'm going to let someone else look after how I'm represented, for example, in a supply chain. So when we look at a supply chain at Blue Number, we are actually concerned not with the products, but with the people, because every product is actually the consequence of the action of people. The fact that somebody's picking a product off a shelf is the consequence of the actor of the consequence of the consumer. There is a whole bunch of preferences on both sides of the chain which are influenced by people. Who is producing and who is demanding, who is supplying, who is buying. All of these are actually choices. So I do often say that there is no such thing as a sustainable product. There are only sustainable people. When you start having sustainable people making sustainable choices, ethical choices, then you get ethical and sustainable supply chains and products that have those values. So the Blue Number system is a suite which we call the ecosystem, and it has certain things. It has an app, it has a control tower, it has partners that can come in that can then use these as a single sign-on, and it has a market that allows for data to be shared and to be exchanged. And all of these things are centric to the person. So that's probably the extent of the sort of the technology behind what Blue Number does. What does this technology do? So this is the more important part. Great, you have some technology. What does it allow you to do? And here are three applications of that technology. We have one application which is a scorecard, a Blue Number SDG scorecard. It allows you to make the impact onto a person. Am I receiving the benefit of the SDGs, as opposed to am I doing things for the SDGs? So I will go into that project a little bit more. The middle one you see, there is a haze map, which is where you can apply Blue Numbers to looking at who is producing what and how much are they contributing to, for example, forest fires in a particular area. So that's a project in the more to B2B and more for, that's actually a palm oil map. And then the last project that we have there, which I've shown, is for workers going to Japan. And they have got a recruitment process or a training program, and we map where they come from and who's employing them. So I'm going to go into a couple of these projects. Here, for example, is our work, one of our types of work on palm oil supply chain. So we can show exactly where the chain is coming from, exactly where the commodities are moving to. And this is because once you have identities in the system, all the way down to farmers, smallholders, for example, and then you couple that and layer that with other information, GPS coordinates, mills, delivery receipts, et cetera, you build that ledger. And you then have a pretty good picture of what's going on. And you can then look at the people involved in this chain, who owns the mill, who is buying the product, et cetera, and what accountability does everybody have all the way down to that last farmer, or, for example, slash and burn farming and deforestation, et cetera. So this is one of those projects. Here's a map that is part of the project that I mentioned with regard to workers going to Japan. These are all the supplying agencies, the recruitment agencies across countries that process recruitments that then go to the trainee programs in Japan. So they have these various departure points, and that's how people end up in Japan. So if we're looking at employing the DACA principles and so forth, we have all of those opportunities there. And what you're seeing on the screen now is our SDG scorecard. This is work that goes down to the farmer level and actually shows how each farmer is impacted or benefits from government programs, corporate programs, buying practices, and therefore what is their SDG profile as a consequence of certain data that they provide, as well as what others we can glean from others. So even if you don't know, I mean, what you saw in the screenshot there was an Indonesian smallholder farm or Indonesian community in the middle of Java. But even if you don't know where people are, and this is what you're seeing on the left-hand side, is you can pick a point which is the closest tier, and you can look at whatever aggregates to that tier. And that, for example, is for a bank in Bangladesh, where you can see there are 155 account holders that accrue to that agent, that rural agent banking facility. The more and more information that you have, and the more and more people who are then enabled with devices, and going back to the accessibility of technology, that means, for example, if somebody just has a smartphone and switches on a GPS, that cluster can disaggregate into the field. So once you start the process of beginning to unravel identities, you can see where it is that these bottlenecks are with regard to how much you know and what you don't know about people involved. Here, for example, we're looking at a report that we have produced using an SDG scorecard approach for a factory in Malaysia. And it's to build an aggregate score of SDGs for the factory, but based on all of the income, all the data that is aggregated from individual workers. So this is 154 workers representing 89% of that factory's workforce. And we go through every SDG to come up with that score at the end that says that this factory can claim to have these SDG impacts all the way across, from gender to carbon footprint, et cetera, et cetera. And this is the degree of granularity that we can go to today. Relatively easy to do something like this, provided, as I said before, everyone has a phone, everyone is willing to participate, and everyone is incentivized to do so. So the next step of that is actually a program that we have recently joined, and we're very happy to be working with Be Slavery Free and Unseen in the first iteration of this, and later on to be able to evolve it in slightly different configurations to other partners, including, we hope, Mekong Club soon. And what you're seeing here is what we call the million makers. So it's targeting 1 million actors at the lowest level, or the first mile, depending on how you look at the chain. Here we have a way for a survey to be adopted, where a worker will be able to choose where they work, and then to be able to enter into a longitudinal data scheme, where over a period of 2 weeks, they are actually answering questions like this. Very simple questions, 5 or 6 questions a day, but spread over a couple of weeks, which means that by the end of the period, you actually have 60 or 70 data points that is tied to that worker in that location, which is, of course, is all a set of claims. But the important thing is that if you've got the same survey being answered, or the same worker answering a survey set of questions from the same location, you can have a very reasonable probability that that is probably a worker with a unique number in that place. And that allows for this Million Makers project. So here you have the overview of what Million Makers is self-onboarding, daily questions, and then they get paid. And the way that they get paid, so for the 2 weeks, the equivalent is 1 day's wages. So what we've done now is we've taken and addressed the first mile of workers. And when we say Million Makers, it can also be, for example, farmers and any system that relies upon a currently invisible tier participating. And that becomes that direct worker voice component, all of which are underpinned by self-sovereign identity. So they are absolutely unique identities, verifiable directly with that individual. And then that is aggregated, anonymized, and so forth, and purchased as a license to use by any actor, whether you are an NGO or a government or a company or a brand that is looking to cross-check audit reports in your supply chain. You can actually purchase a license to use that data which has been produced by the worker and which is their property, and that worker will benefit from that additional income. You won't know who it is, but you will know that they have been verified because they're in the right place answering the right questions, all of which are structured according to the ILO indicators. And you can begin to compare. How does this compare to the audit report that you are getting from your supplier, which will be a point in time? Then you will also be able to determine all the risks for that supplier corroborated against actual worker voice. And fundamentally, you as a brand would be able to issue a declaration and a report that is 100% evidence-based and will not solely depend upon the fact that, well, my auditor said so. If we consider all of the factories, for example, in Southeast Asia, in Malaysia, that have recently had some issues, every single one of those have been independently audited. But if we go back to the points I was making before, availability of technology, accessibility to technology, the willingness to adopt, the ability to adopt. The problem is that tech, which is the audit tech, is not in the realm of everyone. It cannot be checked by everyone. It's a centralized system that is organized and controlled by a few people. And brands themselves run huge risks, reputational risks, that unfortunately those risks and those costs are not shared by the system that is supposed to be protecting the brands and being able to assure the consumers of the brands that they are not involved in human suffering. So if all audit budgets, for example, were now split, half of which went directly to the worker to corroborate the other half, which was the system in which the worker operates. I mean, of course, you always need audits to do technical surveys of, is the equipment in order? Are the processes conforming to standards like HACCP or ISO? That's a given. But does all of that mean that the workers have confirmed that the auditors were in the right place at the right time doing the right thing? That is the check and balance that makes the tech work, and which then comes back to all of the systems that Phoebe, that you were talking about. And very importantly, I did mention cost, because arguably, the ability to adopt is balanced by cost. And to try to do something like this even 1 year ago would have been prohibitively expensive. So you actually then go into a sample mentality and extrapolate out. But we all know the issues with that. I mean, for example, Volkswagen cars, you sample a few in a factory for emissions control, and then you actually have a fleet that's doing something completely different to the climate. All of those cars, of course, were also audited and certified. So what we are doing here with Million Makers is we're saying we need to establish a very simple and transparent contribution program that allows for data to come in, for workers to be compensated for producing data that is then available on shelves for people to license. And this is the kind of structure that we are operating under Million Makers. So somebody participates and they get paid 1 day of working wages for a 15-day cycle. Those who are licensing the data, licensing means that you are not exploiting data by expecting that for free, by sending someone in and expecting a worker to give you data to help your business. You can corroborate it with audits. all answers are anonymous, so data's workers are protected because, after all, it's their property, and they can decide how it is that they wish for that data to be used. And you would get at least 70 data points per worker over a given cycle. And that's incredible value for money when it comes to risk mitigation. So that's our, the culmination of how it is that we are thinking about starting with technology, ending with self-sovereign identity applied into a real use case. I'm going to stop there and hand it back to Nolan and Phoebe. But I hope that that journey was sort of pretty clear.
Great, thank you so much, Pooven, and thank you, Phoebe. So we did have a few questions come in here. So I do encourage everyone, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat. First question I'm going to address from Jenny. This will put this on two sides. I'll ask the question to Phoebe first, and then I'll come back to Pooven. So Jenny provided the example of you have organic products within a supply chain. So there you have the aspect of certification to prove the product that is organic. Now, before I jump into the Blue Number solution, I'd like to hear from Phoebe. What's the difference between certifying organic products versus certifying forced labor?
Thanks, Jenny. Great question. We actually get a kind of variation of this question quite a lot. If only there were a silver bullet certification that we could use to verify that a product is free from forced labor. And I guess this question really highlights the challenges when it comes to ESG even. Understanding a company's performance when it relates to the environment, when it relates to governance, it's a lot more easy to quantify and to measure than it is to measure and quantify their social performance. So we can measure the organic materials within a supply chain. We can measure carbon footprint, for example, or the number of trees that company has planted, or whatever it may be that we need to be measuring. Forced labor as an issue is a lot more complex. There's a whole spectrum of kind of issues within the broader topic of modern slavery: confiscation of identity documents, recruitment fee payments, restriction on freedom of movement, to name just a few. These are conditions that are often changing. You may visit a supplier one day and the next day they may begin implementing recruitment fees or something else. So it's quite a dynamic situation. And it's also, I mean, it's almost impossible to look at any one given situation and say, yes, that is definitively or is not definitively a situation of forced labor at its most extreme, modern slavery. So I think in response to the complexity of this issue and how this is an ever-changing situation, workforces change, they move, suppliers change, they move, even conditions within a country, they change, they move. We've seen this during COVID, especially. Entire populations can become more vulnerable overnight. Then we need to be basing our decisions around forced labor risk on dynamic data as well. Worker voice being a crucial element of that. I would say even the very best in class when it comes to private sector company, especially the multinational brands who are really investing heavily in this area and really kind of proactively going out there to better understand their supply chains, still would hold up their hands and say, you know, we don't know, we haven't seen everything. We believe that there may, or we believe that there are still forced labor issues within our supply chains, despite our best efforts. So there are a lot of challenges around certification in this space, which still need to be addressed before I think we can kind of confidently be making statements in the same way that we can on the environmental side.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Phoebe. And I'm going to pass the same question back over to Pooven. What are the benefits of using Blue Number solution compared to the current solution for certifications?
Well, the benefit of using Blue Number solutions is you will solve most of the problems that Phoebe has just identified. The reality of any certification is it's only as good as what it is that you checked. So if your certification program doesn't look at the problem, doesn't have parameters that are set within the standard that say, look, are you actually checking whether there is any content in the acid rain or the rainfall or the chemicals that lands on the soil, that will not be included in that organic certification. Are you actually checking if all the fields around the organic production site also are organic and there is no seepage and leakage into that field? That will not be within the certification. So the certification can only represent, in the best case scenario, all the data that's in it. So the more information that you have, the more data that you have, which is in that certification, then you can actually qualify something as being whatever it is that you claim it's going to be. So organic is a good example. You can definitely have an organic product that is made by slaves. You can have, a luxury good that is created by child labor. You can buy the most expensive cosmetic that uses mica that was formed from a mine where you have absolutely no idea where the mine is or who was involved in it. You can walk around with a mobile phone that has got the most horrible instances of human suffering in all of the components that are within that phone. So the question is never about the product. The question is about what is behind that product. And no certification scheme today can actually say, well, I can guarantee you that the workers who were involved in this are part of that certification process. And that's the difference between certification and the benefits that Blue Number brings.
So great. Thank you very much, Jenny, for that question. Very great question. Next question, we have one from John regarding and Pooven, this is for you. So the extent for data privacy in the issues of technologies. So for example, if someone identifies themselves through the identity and they wish to hide their identity at a later stage, how does this change? How does this change the approach depending on the jurisdiction of the information that's shared?
So the structure of the question that you've asked is, basically privacy issues, jurisdictions, the ability for people to be able to mask certain information. Now, within the question that you've asked, you've already set up a condition that says that somebody else needs to look after the privacy. The jurisdiction has got to be able to protect me. So we've outsourced the idea of who is responsible and accountable for this information. Now, I would use the example of if you had a vehicle, a car, and it was parked on the street and somebody stole it, you would be able to go to the police and you would say, look, somebody just stole my car. That car has been identified clearly as your property. There is a value to it. There is a loss to it. You can get insurance for it. There is actually no question. If privacy was your car, you would be able to answer this question. The problem is that data is not property unless it is the property of a corporation and it is being worked in a particular way. The reason why we put SSI into the mix is we say that if this becomes your property, people will know that ultimately they are responsible for their own privacy and they will be able to turn the taps on and off with regard to who sees what. Being able to outsource this to a government or to a company is always going to be fraught with risk because you are not in control and you have no recourse if something happens to your data. So privacy is absolutely important, but it's more important that you understand what that privacy means and what your responsibility as the owner of that data will have when it comes to protecting it. So that's, I think the answer to the question is, we currently are not in a position, we are treated in a very patronizing fashion by those people who look after our data, typically for their own ends, whether it's companies or whether it's governments and so forth. We need to be brought back into the game and take control of that. And then we can talk about privacy.
Fantastic. So you brought up the topic of governments and SSI. So I think it's really good for the audience to understand a little bit more of, do international governments recognize SSI, somewhat like a passport? And if not, how do you foresee this happening?
So let's put it another way. International governments recognize passports because it's a creation of international governments. And most international governments don't recognize most passports because they think those passports aren't really worth much. And so if you try to go into an EU embassy or a US embassy and try to get a visa, depending on what passport you have, they'll make that assertion. Is your passport worth anything? Now, when we come to SSI, you've created the SSI. It's your thing. whoever accepts it for whatever reason is up to the other person. It's not a question of, you're now going to suddenly have a new identity that is universally acceptable. It's universally consistent. What goes into an SSI, whether you're creating it in Bangladesh or whether you're creating it in Germany, the components will be exactly the same. The way to credential that will be exactly the same. The digital literacy of the person behind it, we hope, will be exactly the same. The cost of transacting it will be the same. However, that is not the same with passports. And at the end of the day, the passport is not owned by the passport holder. The passport can be revoked, even by the jurisdiction who actually issued it. And usually that is the case. So when you have a worker, for example, in a situation where you have passport retention, that is a very clear sign that that is not an effective identity, because it can literally be removed physically. Whereas with SSI, all you need to do is to find another mobile phone. Just ping yourself back into the system and say, yes, I used to live here, but then I was trafficked, and now I'm here. That doesn't have to be your phone. But the way that an SSI can include certain information, if it was going to include biometrics, if it was going to include this, that, and the other, and you were putting that in so that you could be scanned on a camera anywhere in the world of your own volition and show that you are not lost or that you have not been disappeared. That's very different to a passport.
You make a very good point. The passports can be just taken away at any given time. So it's important to see that the SSI truly has a lot of impact that can bring for supply chains and the workers. On that note, Pooven, so we have another question from one of the audience, from Prad. He'd like to know a little bit more if you're collaborating with social standard setters or auditors on worker voice surveys.
So I have been involved, with setting various standards, particularly voluntary standards, over the last decade or so. And standards themselves have to evolve to accommodate the types of ideas that we are talking about here. SSI and so forth doesn't actually figure in any standard because once you essentially defuse the standard by saying that your standard is really only credible when you have everybody in the standard judging the standard. That the standard is made up by all of the people using the standard. It's not an external party that's coming in and saying, oh, okay, this situation is cool. It actually changes the nature of how we should understand standards in auditing. So are we working and collaborating with those parties? Yes. I would say that the standard setters are people like Mekong Club. The standard setters are people like Unseen and Be Slavery Free. Are we working with auditors? I think auditors are on the receiving end of the request. What do you want us to audit? We're going to go in and we're going to ask certain questions. If you want us to audit this, we will look at the data for that. So I think the profession of auditing does not leave a lot of room for creativity. And we shouldn't be asking auditors to be creative. We should be saying to auditors, listen, what is now material to this audit is this. If you cannot bring me this data that corroborates this in a reliable and robust fashion, then this is not an audit of value to me. This is not protecting me as a brand, as a supply chain manager. Similarly, on the other side, if I'm a worker, I would like for the auditor to represent not just my views in a focus group, but the views of the entire population in the factory in a reasonable fashion. So I think the collaboration of that we're talking about is not to be able to take a fantastic thing like the blockchain and SSI and immutability and decentralization, decentralized ledgers, and bring it back to the very straight line process of auditing. It's actually to evolve auditing to say that this is the minimum, this is what it should be working with in order for it to be qualified.
Fantastic. So just a follow-up question from myself. Do you find million makers or the worker survey voice is a method to replace traditional social audits? And maybe what you can perhaps elaborate a little bit more of what's the differences and or advantages compared to a traditional social audit?
I think, well, traditional social audits, have been notoriously unreliable for a while. As I said, any factory that is involved in any brand's supply chain will have had a social audit done. And yet, for some reason, there is still exploitation. The factories are still burning to the ground. People are still dying. And the consumers are still subject to the human suffering that was in that chain. So I think we can agree that social audits are probably not doing the job that they are supposed to be doing, yet there are vast amounts of money that is spent on extremely bad information. So that has to change. Will million makers resolve that situation? What it will do is it will add a whole new body of data that will be able to police the policemen. It will be able to audit the auditors and therefore make it perhaps a little more trustworthy, which is what we need from social audits. So there is a point at which these two channels of data are operating separately, which is what we've said in the presentations. If you were to split your budget, still do the audit by all means, but the audit is a point in time. It's taking a snapshot of a situation, and that snapshot could have been extremely well orchestrated by your supplier. Please come and visit my factory at this time, go through exactly these steps, and I'm going to create this scenario, this mise en scène, which is, I've basically engineered what you are seeing. This is not an uncommon situation. But if you then have a 2-week cycle that says these are all the extras and the actors on the side that are talking about the food they were served, the access to sanitary facilities, and this, you can't have a toilet set up for 2 weeks because you don't know which 2 weeks, you don't know which workers, you don't know where. That's going to corroborate pretty closely what your auditor did or did not see. So that's the way I think that this is going to evolve. At the end, we're going to see a situation where auditors will become more like the travel agents that we see today. We used to need a travel agent to buy a ticket to go anywhere. Anyone who's buying a ticket through a travel agent today and paying the premium for that, well, that just doesn't happen. Sorry, okay, tickets maybe is already a bit passé because who's been traveling for the last 2 years? But you would go to the internet, you'd find your ticket, you'd do all of that. That's all the cost that you have to bear anyway. But then you'd go to the travel agents, which are the trip advisors, and all of those other sites that are giving you additional information, the value addition of where you're going, what it is that you need to see, where it is that you need to eat, where it is that you need to stay. So auditors have that role of being able to interpret the information, to make that into knowledge, and then to give people risk profiles. So I think there is a role for the expertise that has been built up, but it is certainly not that cash cow rubber stamp exercise that we have been unfortunately suffering under because you need to have an audit certificate before you can sell your goods. That's just not the way that's going to happen.
So do you think it would replace traditional audits completely, or is it more of a complementary?
I think traditional audits have been dead for a while. We just haven't quite realized it.
Fair point. Okay. Thank you. Thank you. So I have 2 more questions here, and it's for both the speakers here. So I'm going to open up the floor with Phoebe here. So Phoebe, one of the questions that came in was, what is a global legislation requiring companies to do related to modern slavery?
Great question. And I think this links up well with the point that Poovan just made. We're moving away from being able to tick box and say, we have this piece of paper that verifies that we have audited our supply chain and everything's fine. Therefore, you can leave us alone. Certainly, global legislation has been slow in this space, but it is changing, and it is beginning to hold companies more accountable for the conditions of their supply chain, even down to raw material level. If you look at legislation that's coming out of Germany, for example, that promises, we've yet to see it in action, of course, so these things sometimes change, but promises to hold companies accountable for any kind of violation related to human rights anywhere within their supply chain, which is, as you can imagine, and due to the complexities and breadth of these supply chains, can be incredibly challenging to hear for many multinational organizations. So certainly legislation is moving in the direction of holding companies more accountable. We're seeing currently, many instances of the US Customs Border Protection agencies seizing shipments of goods at the border coming into the US on suspicion of forced labor concerns from various places around the world. These companies may present a social audit report and say, well, hey, we've done our auditing, but it's not enough. And it's certainly not considered to be enough to simply have these kind of sticking plasters in place. Companies need to be backing up these audits by saying, well, we're speaking to workers, we're taking these kinds of 360 reviews rather than relying on these snapshots in time. This is something that's in progress, and it's kind of coupled as well by the rise in kind of focus on the S within the ESG, which is maybe to an extent more the carrot to the legislation stick in this space. But certainly I would say all roads are leading to more action within the private sector related to forced labor and other human rights issues. And I would say this is kind of reflected in our experience at the Mekong Club. We're an NGO that focuses only on the issue of modern slavery through private sector engagement. And in recent years, we've seen such an uptick in interest, in engagement, and kind of genuine questions and queries from the private sector in terms of what they can actually be doing better within this space, which is great to see. Thanks.
Fantastic. Thank you, Phoebe. Puvin, did you have anything that you'd like to add on top of that?
Yes, I think I'd like to, maybe just reinforce the idea of how, the private sector auditors, the entire group of people who have been working to give everyone the benefit of the doubt, to make sure that things are safe for everyone else. We've been working in an industrial system. It's a very linear system. We've been working with what it is that we have available, how much money we have on the table, what people understand about things. But things change. We are now, in a new era where everyone has a smartphone. Everyone has the ability to contribute. Why would we waste that opportunity? Also, I think businesses like rules, because of course, you then know which rules are flexible. Profit is actually made on the margin, because you can handle, leverage, exploit a rule better than your competitor. But if you don't have rules, the thing that we're going through right now is the period where we do not have rules for these things. If, for example, workers are being taken to court in the UK for unjust enrichment of companies because they have been employing slaves and pushing products into the market, challenge is that 2 pieces of evidence will be submitted, at the time of that trial. There'll be the report that is provided by the auditor that says, oh, everything was cool when I visited the factory. And then you'll have the videos of screaming workers running out of the factory that has been posted on social media. Now, how do you compare these pieces of evidence? So if we have to go to court before we can see this kind of evidence apple for apple, that's a systemic problem. So once we start adjusting the rules to say, well, actually the minimum is going to be this, and all evidence that comes in is going to be necessary, and you need voices from everybody who's involved in the story. And that's where we are now. We're just getting to that new level of what is compliance.
Very good, thank you. I'm being mindful of the time here, but I have one more question. This is for either speaker, so either Puvin or Phoebe, feel free to jump in. How do you make suppliers use new technologies?
I can maybe offer a comment and then I'll pass to Puvin, who I'm sure is very experienced in this. In an ideal world, it wouldn't be a case of making, it would be a case of working together. Nobody wants forced labor and modern slavery. Often these things come about because of conditions that are either imposed by brands on the suppliers or external conditions that both the brand and supplier would like to work together to achieve. So I would actually say moving away from a mindset of making or forcing suppliers to do anything may lead to a healthier all-round supply chain and approach. Of course, sometimes writing things into contracts and, kind of encouraging action through making very clear your expectations when engaging with your suppliers can help. But certainly looking at this collaboratively rather than I'm telling you what to do should have a better impact. And I'm sure Puvin would like to share from his experience on this.
I think Phoebe is much more generous than I am with regard to this. I mean, I think we don't have to make anyone do anything, that's for sure. But if you don't have clarity on what is expected by society at large, then how do you expect anybody to do anything? Nobody makes anyone put seatbelts in cars anymore, but it would be pretty tough if you offered them as optional extras when you're delivering your car to market.
You make a very good point. Very, very good point.
Well said.
So on that note, we're looking at the time here. We'd like to thank everyone that has joined the webinar here. We kindly would like to hear your feedback. So once you close the Zoom chat here, you'll see that a survey pops up. Any of your feedback is very useful. We can cater to new webinars, different topics. So please feel free to share your feedback, and it's greatly appreciated. So thank you once again for Phoebe and Pooben for this great session. And we hope to see you at another session.
Thanks a lot. Thanks, Pooben.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.